expecting a couple more public participants potentially, but we'll just wait and see how that goes along. We've also got Councillor Nicola Young with us, and Councillor Jill Day is with us and listening, but she has a headache, so she's got the screen off so that she doesn't have to have the lights shining in her eyes. We also have John McSweeney here, who is one of our council planners, and Letitia here, who's helping just keep us all organised and helping everybody find where they need to be. It would be great if we could just, for Joanne and Tina and Gordon, if you just wanted to give us a quick introduction of who you are and maybe where you're from in the city and just a little bit of information, and then we'll get started. Maybe okay, Joanne, do you want to go? Oh, Tina, yes, thank you.
I'm never slow. I'm Tina Reid, and I'm actually submitting on behalf of Mount Cook Mobilised. I live in Mount Cook.
Great, thanks, Tina.
Very
Joanne?
good and active residents association, just so you know.
They are wonderful.
I'm Joanne Neville. I'm based in Nio, but I've responded in relation to my family's home in Kandala that we've had for sort of over 40 years.
Yeah.
Thanks, Joanne.
I'm Gordon Purdy. I live in Crofton Downs, and I'm making some submissions about the significant natural areas and landscape for both relating to our property and my father's property in Wilton.
Great, thanks, Gordon. So it sounds like Joanne and Gordon, you might both be here to talk to us a bit about the significant natural areas.
I was just going to say, is everyone in this group focused on that same issue? The significant
no, I'm focused much more on density of housing and character heritage areas and multi-unit dwellings.
So I'm going to suggest maybe we start with Joanne, and then we can move to Tina and then Gordon, and so we can just have a bit of SNAs and then a bit of inner city density and then a bit more SNAs.
Yeah, sure.
And then we'll have questions that once we've heard from all of you, then we'll have time for questions and a bit of conversation. So I'll hand over to you, Joanne.
Yeah, so I'm here to talk about the issue that's impacted me and my family, which is the SNAs, which is the significant natural areas. My family moved into Kandala over 40 years ago and bought a home there, which we've had ever since and, you know, completely love. And then a year or so ago got a brochure in the mailbox talking about SNA and how we would be impacted, which was concerning at the time. And then we realized, we found out how significantly our family home would be affected. 51% of our land area would be designated SNA, and it goes up to 1 metre away from our house. And that's an area that we can't touch without, you know, Wellington City Council permission. And that's private land. It was so significant and so distressing for our family, still is. And that's why I'm here today. So the big things for us is that we would like to have just the autonomy to manage our land the way that everybody else that owns private land in Wellington does. We would like to have autonomy over 100% of our property, not 49% of it. The other thing that really impacts us or has caused us a lot of distress is the recognition of the impact that will have on that as an asset for our family. The Wellington City Council valuations that we were provided with indicated that we would lose between sort of 15 to 30% of the value of our property once it was designated SNA, just because of the significant volume of our land that would be designated and unusable by us. Usable, but not, you know, fully usable for us in the same way that your properties might be for you. And also the fact that it's not voluntary. We don't get to choose if we do this. It is something that is forced upon us or is likely to be forced upon us. And that's really horrendous, really distressing. And because it only affects a really pretty small number of Wellingtonians, it's probably not something that you have much pushback on. because there's only a few hundred families that are affected. So you probably don't get much noise about it, and you might not think it's a big issue, but it is for those that are affected, as you would be if 51% of your property was going to be sort of designated and taken away from your sort of full private control. The thing that comes up for us time and time again is that our area, and this might be the same for you, Gordon, is not unique. It is not special. It is not significant or different from thousands of properties around ours, and yet ours has been determined that it will be taken in this way and used in this way. We don't have any unique flora or fauna on our property. And so that's something that really grinds our gears, that there's, thousands and thousands and thousands of properties in Wellington with very similar sort of natural features or flora and fauna, and ours specifically, a few hundred of ours, has been sort of designated as the land that will be taken or used. And overall, I think 5% of the SNA area is private residential property, which is quite a small area of the total. If you're looking to take people's, or put aside people's land, 5% of it, I think, is private residential. And I would just request and ask and beg, can we just be left with our private residential property? Can that 5% just be taken out of this whole equation, and we be left to enjoy and use our properties the same way that you get to enjoy and use yours?
Thanks, Joanne. I really appreciate you sharing that with us, and acknowledge that obviously that's caused you and your family a lot of distress. And so just really want to acknowledge and thank you for coming and sharing with us quite openly. I'm sure we will have more questions once we've gotten through this. So I'm going to move to Tina now. Tina, if you can share with us some of your views from the Mount Cook point of view, that would be lovely.
Thank you. Totally different issues. And I was aware when I wrote the submission that we were concentrating only on Mount Cook issues, but that was the point, I suppose. So I didn't even look at the special natural area stuff. We are really unhappy about the blanket, well, it's not quite blanket, but the 21 metre height over most of Mount Cook. That's 7 to 9 stories, and given the nature of the whole area, we feel it would be dominating, and even worse, it would pepper pot very badly, that on sites where it could happen, there'd be 1 or 2 stories and then suddenly 21 stories. So generally, we're making a plea that we consider bringing the whole area to 11 metres, as it is now, which if you look at a lot of the development, 3 stories, I mean, there's a big new one on the corner of Rugby and Tasman Street, quite close to me, that I think is probably within the 11 metres or not far out. It's still quite densification of housing, because we acknowledge that this is a dense housing area and that medium density housing is really important. But we do think 21 metres is totally unreasonable. Even more so, there's a very odd one, which I asked for information from the council and I didn't get. The Wellington High School site, not Massey University, just the high school site, is designated for 50 metres. Now that's the top of Mount Cook, behind the old museum. Imagine 50 metres up there. And I asked at the council open session in Newtown about what the rationale for that designation was. And a nice planner guy who I spoke to said he'd get back to me, but he never did. So I never did get any rationalisation for 50 metres. I gather it's the same as the hospital, which I haven't looked at, the issues around the hospital, but I claim that the hospital and high school are totally different situations. So that's our first point. 21 metres over this area is too blanket. Our second area is around the design of multi-unit buildings. We're going to see a lot more. We're watching the ones which happen with interest, and they're happening all over the place. We think sunlight is very important. At the moment, in the district draft plan, it talks about so many 2 hours of daylight. Daylight can be minimal. We're talking about the need for properties to have some sunlight and ventilation and airflow. So we do ask that the provision for sunlight is considered, along with a whole raft of provisions about things like boundary setback. Looks like there's no provision any longer for a metre setback, and the idea of properties being right on these pavement or right on neighbouring properties at a metre without any resource consents, we think is unreasonable. We think there still needs to be a site coverage limit for multi-storey buildings, so that there is so much of a site has to be designated open space. And we think the recession planes need to be lowered so that there's not such steep recessions on people's boundaries. So it actually comes down to and I'm not sure how we do this in the district plan, but somehow we need to ensure that design is the key feature rather than height and number of dwellings. And I mean, we've seen so many appalling apartment blocks in Te Aro, and we're just really anxious that there'll be more and more of those around Adelaide Road and in areas designated as multi-storey. So talking about design for multi-storey buildings that comes down to good design a lot. And our final point is around character housing. We have several areas that are designated character housing. We would like to have seen more. We feel that it's been too limited, the character housing designation. And that then, again, somehow the plan should be very sympathetic in the way it is now, actually, to infill and improvements on the site. If you walk up and down around Mount Cook, you see a lot of houses have been subdivided into several apartments. A lot of them have sleep outs that are rent separately. Some have been converted into 2 apartments or have a separate dwelling where they can. These kinds of infills are really valuable to improve housing density. And somehow being able to enable or encourage infill and a larger character housing area would be our preference. So those are the areas I'm talking about. The height, with particular mention of high school, design and multi-unit buildings, and how we can manage, hopefully increase the character housing area, but certainly encourage infill and improvements. So we're continue to get medium density in this area without having to tear down old buildings.
Thanks, Tina. Councillor Young, I see you, but I'm going to take questions and comments once we've heard from all the public participants. So I'm just going to keep you at the front of the list there while we move on to hear from Gordon.
I'll
Gordon,
turn my
over to
hand
you.
down so it doesn't annoy people.
Okay, thanks, Councillor. Gordon, over to you. I'd love to hear about what you have to share with us today.
Yeah, maybe I might just talk about my father's property first, because it flows reasonably well. He purchased the property about 60 years ago, and this is a property which is about half of it's been mapped as a significant natural area. He was surprised. He purchased it about 60 years ago. I don't think it's particularly significant. It's got exotic trees in it, which you can see from the public roads. If you look, it's got trees which I would consider pest trees, and excuse me, Pūroro, which is not native to Wellington, and so I don't think Pūroro could be considered a significant natural area. It was basically, when they bought the property, it was covered in gorse and a new subdivision. And what my father says, that if you want to have forest like he's got, all you do is do nothing, and the trees will grow. And so we think it's my father's largely confined to the house now, but we think that if it's reasonable to restrict what he does on the property, then maybe they should try all residential properties restrictions. Everybody could leave half their property available for native trees to regrow. I'm not sure why, because he's done it, he's going to be restricted as to what can happen to that property, and other people who don't do it are not. The the council could require everybody to set aside half their property for significant natural areas. And another issue is which is how tall some of these trees will grow. I know as neighbours are concerned about the growth of some of those trees because they block their vegetable gardens of sun and things. And he's got some trees which are probably about 10 metres from the house, which will grow to 30 metres. And is the council accepting liability if they blow into his house because they've said he can't trim them? It's, so maybe I could talk about our property in Crofton Downs, and in contrast, we consider our property as a significant natural area. So we regard it as quite a significant natural area, but we don't. But not all of what has been mapped by the council is a significant natural area. Like our vegetable garden, we don't consider our vegetable garden a significant natural area. It illustrates an issue we've noticed elsewhere in this mapping. I don't know when this mapping was done or what purpose it was done for, but the mapping doesn't seem sort of appropriate for what it's being used for. When they first came out, it included asphalt roads and new subdivisions as significant natural areas, apart from vegetable gardens and people's clotheslines and things. So maybe I think basically the mapping needs to be rejected and something done fit for its purpose, which I'll talk more about in a later. It's basically, even though we think our property is largely a significant natural area, we don't agree with the restrictions on its use. So we note that some of the proposed restrictions of use council proposed 10 years ago, and we raised the issue in the Environment Court, and the Environment Court rejected it. And now we find the council proposing it again, the same provisions. And we don't think we should have to go to the Environment Court in 10 years to have the same provisions rejected. We don't, in fact, more to the point, we don't think the restrictions are needed to achieve the objectives. We purchased a property for residential purposes. It was when it was purchased, it was zoned rural residential, and the intention was for normal residential activity in our case the native bush. We live in the bush, we live with the bush, we interact with the bush on a daily basis. It's not a separate zone from our lifestyle. We're in and out of the bush many times a day. It is part of our property. So one solution we suggest is that the plan could just say normal residential activities are permitted activity in a significant natural area. I just might also comment that there has been a bit of loss of the natural area around here, and it's generally not been a result of residents' activities. It's been a result of council decisions. It has resulted in most of the significant loss of forest of this natural area. So residents typically live with it and don't interfere with it very much. We've made some other suggestions that so a couple of issues in the current restrictions are suggestion that track building would not be permitted on these properties, but except on the public land. So we think these restrictions should be removed. And restrictions, if there's any restrictions, they should be no different between the publicly owned land and the privately owned land. Building a track has minimal impact on the environment. We have tracks through our forest, and nobody would know. They don't affect the environment to the very minimal effect on the environment. So there's some wording in the thing which says public and Department of Conservation or regional or territorial authority. So at the moment, the district plan proposes that publicly owned land can have tracks built on it, but privately owned land cannot. Another issue is, which I mentioned before with my father's property, but also applies to probably most properties, is the trimming of trees. So our trees are trimmed every year or two because they just grow. You trim virtually all the native trees, which we trim. Very occasionally one dies, but most of them just resprout and grow quite vigorously after trimming. So when we're on a southerly slope, and it's basically necessary to trim the trees to maintain the house, really, to retain some light into the house, and they're trimmed frequently. And so we think that the restriction on trimming should be removed from the draft plan as well. And the other thing is, if you look at this mapping, there are bits of the outer green belt which are mapped as significant natural areas and bits which are not. And it's difficult to see the objective, difficult to see how this achieves the objectives. There's what I'd call dog legs. So you might have an area which is zoned as a significant natural area, and then it has a bit sticking into it, which is not zoned as a significant natural area. And I'm not sure why on earth you'd protect the forest on one bit, but not this little bit in the middle. And I think it relates back to the comment before that the mapping doesn't seem to have been done for the purpose of this plan. It seems like some rather old mapping which has been picked out for some other purpose. And essentially, we think that all the outer green belt should be allowed to regenerate. So we think the entire outer green belt, unless there's a good reason not to, should be allowed to regenerate into native forest. And then we would truly have a significant natural area in Wellington. And just about an hour before the submissions were due, I noticed that our property had been mapped as an outstanding landscape. And we didn't know this until I just noticed it just when I was about to make our submission. We think the restrictions in the significant outstanding landscape should be dropped. The restrictions basically would have said we couldn't have built a house or other things, which had minimal impact on the landscape. There was a landscape report which complements the development of this site, a council landscape report from a couple of decades ago. So we think that either our property should be removed from the outstanding landscape, or the outstanding landscape rules should be substantially changed to permit normal residential activity like we have. This particularly affects one of our neighbours' properties, which I think the current district plan change, proposed drafted plan, would make their property virtually unvalueless, because they couldn't, if they were to apply all these rules to them, they wouldn't be able to do anything virtually useful. But that covers it, I suppose.
Thanks, Gordon. Really appreciate that. So we've got 23 minutes for us to have a bit of a chat and conversation and ask for questions in this session. And Councillor Young, I remember that you were first. So over to you with a question.
So it's really just for Tina, just thinking about the positioning of Wellington High School. Has anyone done any wind calculations of that area? Because 50 metres would be extraordinary up there. You're like having Sky Tower in the middle of your suburb.
I have no idea. It was, as Gordon said, it was something we noticed when we were looking at the district plan, at the maps with all the coloured blobs on it. And 50.4 metres actually is the high school zone.
Wow.
Up behind the museum. It's just one designated zone that's clearly the high school.
Because the thing is, I mean, I walk through there regularly, well, several times a week actually, and it would actually affect the whole city view of the Carillon and the old Dominion Museum.
It would be totally dominating at the top of Mount Cook there.
Yeah.
It'd be terrible.
Tina, thank you. Really good thing to point out. And I know John McSweeney's on the call, so John, are you listening to this bit?
Yes, I am listening to this. I did have a look at the planning maps. I thought it looks to me like it's 33.6 metres, but I may be looking at. But yeah, I can check that again. But I mean, I think that
33.6 is the high school site.
Yeah.
Sorry, the Massey site. And between that and the museum, there's a block that says 50.4 on the map I've got. Yeah.
Okay, all right, stand corrected.
Thanks, Tina. I think that's definitely something we're going to want to follow up.
It's a wrinkle I'm sure John will sort out for us. My fingers are crossed. Thank you, Tina, for your advocacy and draw it to our attention. That's the end of my question.
Thank you, Councillor Young. I have a question both for Joanne and Gordon, which is, I think a lot of people in the city who have had their properties identified as significant natural areas, they actually feel really proud of the bush that's on their properties, and they want to look after it. So I guess my question for you would be, what do you think we should do to kind of protect and support the bush that's around? What would you like us to do instead?
You know, I mean, Gordon, you might have a different point of view, but my parents bought the property over 40 years ago, and the whole area had been leveled by a fire. So it was down to the absolute ground. There was nothing growing there whatsoever. And now there is, you know, like bush, very dense bush, which they care for, you know, for years. And there's not a weed. There's like, we have council properties and parks all around our area with blackberries, wandering willy, convolvulus through it. Like one area from when I was 5 years old through to now has never been cared for. It's terrible. And that's Wellington City Council area, and ours, you know, a couple of 100 meters away, has been very carefully looked after. You're right, like people that have these areas of land care for them. My parents have not been able to touch any of the trees for the last year because they've been instructed that they're not permitted to. The trees are growing over their house, like it's encroaching now on their property. That it's going to affect their views. It's awful. And 12 months ago, they could care for it, they could prune it, they could, you know, take ones that were dying or decaying and you know, put them down and get other ones growing in their place. They did really care for it. I think you need to do nothing. I think you need to do nothing for this 5% of people's residential private property. You don't need to do anything. My parents are not going to do anything to destroy that land. The people around them are not. It's actually something that they value significantly around their own property. They just want to be able to use it as they always have and care for it the way they always have. And this puts a real sort of barrier in that. This puts a really negative kind of barrier of the city council now has control of all of that area of my land. So I would say do nothing, just leave it. And Gordon had a really good point before. The council already has like actually huge amounts of land. Care for that, look after that, regenerate that, get rid of the noxious and out of control weeds in that area. Look after your own backyard before coming after ours, is what I would say.
Thanks, Joanne. Really appreciate that. Gordon?
Yeah, I think similarly, I think that talking about my father's and our place, I think for my father's property would be similar, do nothing. And for our property, I think the council needs to not permit further residential housing in it on ours or the surrounding properties. I think they are quite significant, except there is one property, and there's a block of 5, I think, properties, maybe 6, and there's one of them which doesn't have a house on it. So I think it would be reasonable to allow the owners of that to erect a house, but erecting no further houses in the property will effectively, that's all the council needs to do, protect the forest, because the bush, it's additional housing which results in the destruction of the forest.
Thank you, Gordon. Really appreciate that answer. Councillor Day.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your thoughts on the SNAs. This is one that I have sort of been brought into a few of the conversations, and like Councillor Conte, I've heard of a mixture of reactions. But Joanne, you said something at the beginning which I thought was interesting, and I'd like to understand a little bit more about it, which was around the change to the value of the property. Because what I have actually heard is that over time it could actually have the reverse effect, and that actually your properties could have more significant value because they have something that a lot of people don't have on their properties. So I'm interested in what you've heard.
Yeah, it's got that now. And well, it did have it. Well, my parents were able to sort of maintain and care for their property, which they can't do currently. So I think it has got that you know, that value now, and that the valuations that we're referring to are the ones that have been done by the council, where the valuers have determined looked at a range of properties and determined the negative financial impact of the value of that property. And it's, you will know it better than me, but from memory, it's, you know, around 15 to 30% of the value of your property is wiped away. My parents are in their 80s. I don't know when and if they might be selling that property, but like you're saying, you know, potentially in 40 years it would be worth more. I mean, they don't have 40 years, and this is kind of ruining their current years, to tell you the truth. This is a really distressing and horrendous thing that's happening to them, which I just wish we could take away and get you guys to stop. Like, how long is this going to go on for? How long do they have to go through it? I don't know, but I would love for that to stop. Yeah, so the value, I mean, do I believe what you guys are doing is going to put their value of their property up? Absolutely, definitely not. From the valuations that have been given to us, no. And from what I can see you guys do with caring for your own properties and the land around our area, no. I don't think that there's any benefit to us with you guys, you know, stepping in this way. I think it's only one way negative. And I think also, if you want to take their land for your, like, for this benefit, if you determine that you want to take 51% of their land that goes to a meter of their house, like Gordon said, like, you know, you're taking the vegetable garden, you're taking the paths out the back, you know, they can't do anything with that. You're taking all of it, and give them financial recompense for what it's worth. If they lose 20% of the value, give them that value. I think that's the only fair way for you to do this transaction. It can't all be a one-way streak of what you guys want to take from my family and from other families in Wellington. Make it a fair transaction if you determine that this is critical for your objectives going forward.
Thank you, Joanne.
Councillor Fitzsimons.
Yeah, look, my question's probably really for Tina. You commented around the appropriateness of more housing in Mount Cook, and I'm just wondering, what do you think we should do about the fact that rents are too high to keep key workers here, and young people see home ownership as something that is really, really unlikely to be possible for the vast majority of them? So, you know, what do you think the approach should be to what's being commonly called the housing crisis?
Well, we're the site of the major social housing projects in Wellington are happening in Rolleston Street and in Hankey Street. So, or in Hopper Street. We've impacted more than any other community in the city about multi-height, multi-dwelling, dense housing. I was really interested in a couple of studies I read around encouraging older people to subdivide houses to share them with either families or their own families or younger people. I think we've got to somehow change our attitudes towards private housing, with a lot of people like myself living in a 4-bedroom house on my own. I've solved that by usually having at least one flatmate. And that's unusual among my contemporaries. So I think ways of, I think if one worked with organisations like Wellington Housing Trust and Age Concern, there'd be ways of opening up more places and existing residences for people. But it would need to be approached as a kind of, how do we use existing stock to provide more housing for people, and who would be interested in being part of that conversation? Because it's not an easy solution. I mean, the development, anyone who's not been up there to see in Rolleston Street with that's Kāinga Ora, the Kāinga Ora housing, is just incredible. Like, they're putting, I forget the numbers, where there were 60 units, they're putting 180. And we've got the same stuff happening in Hopper Street. Tiara, which was opened a couple of years ago, is already housing more than it housed before. And those are big impacts on a community like Mount Cook. And we're not a very big geographical area. but we do think it's really important to somehow find ways of keeping some of the character housing and that designation between CBD and a neighbourhood, keeping the potential for neighbourhood happening rather than just CBD creeping. So sorry, it's not, if it was simple, we'd have solved it. But it takes multiple solutions, I reckon, and multiple people and organisations, and probably a conversation that starts to shift our attitudes around individual home ownership.
Thanks, Tina. Appreciate that. I've got another question for Gordon. Gordon, can you, I was just really interested, you talked about that you'd taken council to the Environment Court over similar restrictions 10 years ago. I'd be really keen to follow that up. Can you tell us a bit more about how I would find that case and a little bit about it?
It was raised to Plan Change 61, which was the council wished to allow more housing in this. So I said there's about 6 properties right near ours, 1, 2, maybe 5. And so the council proposed to allow most of those properties to put another house in the bush area, and we objected to that. Also, that was Plan Change 61. They also proposed things like sort of no track building, which we also opposed. And I think certainly the effect of our appeal was successful in the sense there has been no more housing, but basically the Environment Court made it, in my opinion, very difficult for our neighbours to put more houses in, and also said we can build tracks, and I can't recall what other issues, but those were the main issue for us at the time was the additional housing which was proposed, which is why I say so the biggest threat to this bush here, which I think is significant, has been this city council. And I could go through the history. I go through the history prior to that. So there's already more housing than the original zoning permitted, and now there's quite a lot more housing than so. Although we were successful in holding back the proposal houses, there was. I said we were successful. There was something like 3 new houses, which resulted in the loss of all the forests from one of the properties, which had previously been part of the rural residential zone. So there's a lot of the they seemed to ignore our submission on that property, but essentially as a result of that plan change, there was a loss of part of the forest area.
Thanks, Gordon. I guess, Joanne, if you wouldn't mind me following up, I mean, one of Gordon's suggestions was that for an S&A property, essentially we should just say, look, you can't do any further residential development, or that a property with S&A on it can just have 1 residential house on it. How would you feel about that? Or is that still too much of a restriction?
I think that people should have like the same rights as other like home owners. My parents, I mentioned, are in their 80s. They've never had any intention of building a property on that site, and you'll know in Wellington a lot of the area is kind of like that. And I see places going up around, you know, on areas like that. So it's humanly possible, of course, but it's not something that interests them. But I think it's not ideal to remove people's ability to develop their areas if they wanted to, because I can't speak on behalf of all of the people that are in this category, and there will be some people where they do want to do that. They've got the land to do it and the space to do it, and like 40 years ago it was flattened by a fire. It was down to the weeds. There was nothing. Like Gordon mentioned, people that cleared the area, built those houses, you know, 10 years ago or whatever, have had the opportunity to be unrestricted, and then, you know, now that same property would be restricted in this way. I mean, I think just please leave the properties alone. Like, don't do this. Just leave the areas as they are. You like them at the moment, they're very likely to stay like that. And also, don't people have to get a consent when you build a home? Like, if it was inappropriate to build, like, I guess it would be stopped during that process. Like, you guys have requirements on building now. Can that just not be the restrictions that are or requirements that are put against our property as it would be against yours? Those same
Yeah,
rules?
so that essentially if you wanted to build a house, you'd have to apply for a resource consent, but it might be permitted. That consent could be granted. Is that what you mean, Joanne?
Well, just that my parents and other people with residential properties would be given the same rules and opportunities as other homeowners. So yeah, I mean, Gordon mentioned you're not going to take 51% of every Wellingtonian's property, and you laugh because people would be outraged, and that's kind of how we feel. Don't take ours. Like, look after your own areas. You guys have got lots and lots and lots. The maps show you've got lots of areas. Please look after those. Clear the noxious weeds, put in natives, do that for the next 10 years. Focus on that, focus on your own stuff, and just leave people's private land to them. You can see people are doing a pretty good job largely. So just leave it to them. They take a lot more care of this land than what you guys have in pieces of your land. So yeah, just I don't think restrictions at all.
Thanks, Joanne. Appreciate that. We've probably got time for one more question, councillors, if somebody has another burning question.
Could I just clarify quickly?
Yeah.
When you said, I said that there should be restrictions of no more residential development. I was meaning that just on our property in Crofton Downs and the surrounding 5 or 6 properties, not on the other ones like Joanne and my father's property. And
thanks, Gordon.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Well, thank you all for coming in. Really, really appreciate your time and you guys taking the time to come and talk to us. I do want to say before you go, Joanne, that even though it is a small number of people who are affected by SNAs, we are definitely hearing from you. And we are definitely hearing from lots of people who are affected by this. So I don't want you to feel like you're a lone voice in the wilderness. You know, and I'm sure that over the next, as I said, we've got more hearings today and Friday, and we're definitely hearing more about it. So thanks for taking the time to come and talk to us today.
Just
really appreciate it.
A final question for you, kind of what happens, because this feels like something that's just like a black cloud over us for such a long period of time, and it feels like it's, you know, potentially never going to end. Is there actually a decision point or some point where like this will finish and hopefully just, you know, be left by the wayside?
Yes, John, I'll have a go, and then maybe John can come in and make sure if I'm giving you the correct information. So we are, the staff are going through all of the submissions that we've received, and they will prepare what they're going to call a notifiable district plan, just sort of like a final version that will come to council for us to vote on and for us to formally notify. And the plan is, John, when's the date for that? Are we hoping that that's going to be in May or June?
23rd of June.
Okay, so at the moment they're scheduled to come to council for a vote on the 23rd of June. Once that plan has been notified, so there's a decision point there for councillors to make about what we want to do about significant natural areas, which will be, and we will get advice from staff about what they've heard and what they think, if any changes they think we should make to significant national areas. And we can also then decide that we don't agree with them and make different changes at that point in time. And then once the plan has been notified, so once councillors have made that decision, then it goes into a more of a judicial process. So there will be more hearings that you can make submissions on, and those will go to independent commissioners rather than to councillors. So it becomes a bit more of a formal process. So that's kind of a quick overview of what we're looking at in terms of next steps.
Okay.
What did I do, John?
Very good.
Thanks for clarifying that.
No problem. All right. Hey, thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. I hope you have a lovely day. Get out and enjoy some of the sunshine. And councillors, I'll see you at in some of our future panels.
Thank you.
Thanks
Appreciate
a lot.
your time.
Thank you.